Hi everyone, this is just a quick daily session as promised, or our mock daily sessions, how we intend to run things to give feedback to kind of keep it in line with feature film productions and how things normally run at the big facilities. So we kind of intended to run it this way just to keep it more real world for you, and we're going to continue to develop this as well to the point where eventually what we hope to be able to do is make comments together while we're both sat in the same room, and we can both comment on these things much in the same way as you may have a VFX soup and a 2D soup or a CG soup sat in the Dailies room together, or just kind of just freestyling it and making comments as they see things, just to make it a bit less formal, because daily sessions are often fairly informal. There'll be a few of the top soups all commenting at once, so we're going to try and kind of keep things in line with that. But for now, let's just have a quick look at the plate, which is what we have here. So I've just prepared a very quick PSD with all the work in progress images that were saved onto the forum. I'm just going to go through one by one and just have a quick look and give some kind of feedback as I see things, and just kind of go from there really. And anything that pops up, anything that I notice, just spend a few minutes on each image, mentioning anything that we see and giving some general sort of advice and feedback. Yeah, in daily sessions normally these only run for each shot will only run for maybe a minute, a couple if there's something very specific that's being discussed, but with the volume of shots that has to go through in a daily session, you might have 30 or 40 in a session. Sometimes that can go up to a couple of hundred on one of the bigger projects, especially at crunch time. But each submission to a daily session will only get very limited time for a look from the supervisors, so they're normally kept pretty robust. That we may spend a little bit more time than that, just because the aim here is to be able to offer you some advice along the way as well as just critiquing the work. So we shall try and do that. So no particular order here, just whatever order I pulled these in at, but let's have a look at Scott first. So the first thing that I noticed, and I know this is something that you've noticed yourself as well, Scott, is that there seems to be some degradation in the image quality, and I'm not sure what's causing that. I know that was something that you were a little concerned about, and we can see that there's some kind of pixelation going on that doesn't appear to be there in the original image. This could be down to some of the when we reposition images, when we do a lot of manual transforming and warping and those sort of things, we will start to lose a little bit of image quality, and it does look like that's been the case on this one. I couldn't actually get it to line back up to the plate again, so I'm not sure what conversion process this has been through, but that could be the cause for some of that. So that's the first thing to just note, is that when we're working on these things, it's always best, unless specifically asked, best to keep these just totally in the same format as the plate, so that it's really easy to do comparisons against the plate when we bring these up. That's how we mostly do work in feature film. There's almost always a plate that we can do a direct comparison with, so that the soups can just flick from one to the next and get a feel for whether they think it's working, whether it feels natural to them. So moving on to the actual work that's been done here, I'll tell you what I'm going to do just to make this easier, so I don't have the plate competing in the background. I'm just going to flatten this down over black just to take a quick look and lock that off again. Okay. Alright, so if I do a quick toggle back and forth, I'm just going to start by looking at the cleanup work, which looks good actually. It looks like you've sort of maintained an edge down here that feels about right, although we've got some cropping going on. It looks like you've managed to recreate the bottom edge quite nicely. Take a look at whether there's some colour bleed, because it feels, again, this may be down to some of the pixelation that's coming through. It feels like there's some red pixels or some warmer pixels that are still peeping through here, which could be from leftover remnants of the object that's been removed here. Which I don't actually know what that is, but it does look like it's a similar sort hue, so just check that out and see whether that's the case. But the actual cleanup work there looks good, and that's the case with the cars as well. Really, that there's nothing too much to critique there. Just be wary of trying to keep your edges consistent. You can get too perfect on something like this. There are obviously natural inconsistencies in curb or sidewalk edges like this, so having a little bit of wobble in them doesn't necessarily scream out that it's been a cleanup job, but just try and make sure that there isn't too much of that. I mean, you can see this, some of that even in the plate, some of that kind of wobble that you might not have painted in if you'd done it. You might have tried to keep it straighter if you'd painted it in. So it's not the end of the world, but just be aware that if you've got any serious wobble going on, you might need to just straighten it out a little bit, just so that it doesn't draw the eye, because sometimes making things just a little bit too perfect is okay, just so that it doesn't draw the eye. So taking a look at some of the other cleanup here, the work on the side of the building looks good. Everything feels quite natural. It looks like some of the window frame here may be losing a bit of contrast, but it's not the sort of thing that I think would really be picked up. It does look, it looks fairly natural. I think you'd get away with that. The replacement brickwork looks fine. It's maybe a little bit saturated compared to the plate, and we've lost kind of some of the sense of the lighting that's coming through. But yeah, in general, that's all looking pretty good up there. So nothing too much to critique really with the cleanup work. I think that's all working well. The set extension now, I've made myself some little perspective lines, which you'll notice don't actually meet at a perfect point, which is just down to the natural kind of inconsistencies in some of the edges that we see in the plate. These do line up to edges in the plate, but just because of natural kind of variation and everything's not 100% straight. If this was perfect CG, then it would be, but this does have some lens distortion in it, and also just some of the edges on some of this stuff won't quite be straight. I mean, you can actually see some of the undulation going on in the road surface, so that's no surprise really, but you can see they all kind of converge around the same point, just not to a perfect pinpoint. So I'm just going to use that as a quick guide when I'm testing perspective, which in this case is going to be quite tough again because the image is actually moved. These edges they no longer line up, so it's not going to be too easy to use as a test, but just eyeballing it feels quite nice. We maybe feel as if we're looking a bit too far off into the distance. It might be nice to close this off a little bit at the end with something else, something bigger, or maybe introduce some bigger shapes back here, just to close off the end so that it doesn't feel like it's going off into infinity. But it generally at a glance feels pretty good. One thing to just note is that when you see sides of buildings like this, if you notice when we look at the plate where we see the sides of buildings, we're really only seeing very, very sharp lines down this edge. What I mean is the actual face there from one side to the other is very small. When you start seeing really long faces like this, it does start to stand out as a bit of a set extension, because it tends to feel like it's a face that's been shot more flat on and then distorted into place, whereas something like this is obvious that it's been shot at that angle, so you might need to do a little bit more work on some of that stuff, because obviously the closer it gets to coming to that vanishing point, the more acute that angle's going to get, more like we see over here, where really we're just getting the indication down those real sharp narrow faces down here, and it's the profile that's kind of punctuated by bits that are coming out that give you the real clues. So maybe take another look at something like that, just see if you can make it feel a bit more natural. But the colour matching looks good. There's nothing about the lighting that stands out to me, so I think this is all going in the right direction. It would just be nice to kind of finish this off with some larger building shapes, maybe not have it disappear quite so far into the distance, and I think you can finish that up nicely. Okay, moving on to Lorenzo then. So in this one again, it looks like there's some transformations that have gone on onto the plate, which just be wary if that hasn't been requested. That can be the sort of thing that can immediately get a submission kicked out of dailies in a real world scenario. I mean, it does happen. You know, people still accidentally make a change to the plate that they haven't really realised they've made. But just be wary of that because it can quickly get kicked back because they don't want to waste supervisors' time with showing something that they're not going to be able to do a comparison with, so they'll pull it out of the daily session. But this is fine. It looks like it's actually just had a little slight rotation on it, if anything, probably just to try and give yourself some horizontals that are a bit more accurate and straight. So it's fine. We can definitely do an easy comparison with this. It's not too much of a change there. So just doing a quick back and forth. First thing to note is, again, relating to the trying to keep the integrity of the plate. It looks like some of the contrast has increased in the stuff that hasn't, even in the stuff that hasn't changed. The saturation seems to pop a little bit. It could just be due to export settings. Sometimes things change a little bit depending on export settings and stuff, but make sure that global grading isn't going onto the plate unless it's specifically been requested that there's a global grade that goes onto the plate. Other than that, let's take a look at the cleanup. So again, the cleanup feels nice and natural. The continuation of the kind of slushy snow on the street looks good. The corner where the building meets the ground feels fine. It doesn't stand out in any way. We feel like there's maybe a part in here on the curve where it thins out a bit too much, because we go from thick to really thin and then it thickens out a little bit. So might need just a bit more attention to detail just to make sure that really feels like a proper continuation. But I have to say the work on this side looks really good. It looks really strong. There's some kind of natural stuff going on in the plate that we could maybe try and keep and try and continue on some of these lines that we're seeing on the road surface in the plate. But what I really like about this is that the curb on this side feels really nice. It's got the little dips, the same as we see over here, the little dips in the curb surface. It feels very natural, and the perspective looks right. So that gets a definite thumbs up. It looks really nice. So let's move on and keep looking. So the removal of the banner there looks great as well. Nothing to critique there. So let's start having a look at some of the work done on the building. So we're starting to move into kind of the set extension stuff now, and at first glance this looks pretty good. You've gone for the big poster here, which you do see in on the sides of buildings like that, especially in commercial areas. Take a look at some real ones. I think you could really improve the realism of this by taking a look at some real proper posters that have gone up that are that scale, because you can often tell straight away from the way that they're put up that there does tend to be little partition lines. There's weathering. There's often little ripples and stuff in those. Just things that give it away. Sometimes tears, folds where corners have come away, that sort of thing. So if you're going to do something like that, it's fine. Just make sure that you kind of really look at those real world scenarios where you have that sort of thing, and then copy all those just those tiny little nuances that are going to push this from looking like an image to actually looking like something that was there in the scene. Up here it feels pretty good. One thing, it feels like we're maybe getting a bit too much lighting on these front faces compared to the front faces on the building down here in the front. Obviously we are going to start getting some kind of general dynamic occlusion or ambient kind of occlusion as we come down into the street level, just where the light is having to bounce around a lot and starts to fall off as it gets down into the lower street surfaces. So you might expect to see a little bit more light bouncing around up in the top, especially where it's more open from these buildings. But some of these front faces just feel a little bit too bright. So just take a look at those. And I'm gonna cheat and just push in a little bit just to check out some of the details on that. It's not something that would often be done in production. Occasionally it happens that a supervisor will ask the editorial team to push in a little bit just to check the details in an area, but in doing so you can see the perspective lines on the roof tiles that you put in don't seem to match up with the edge of the guttering, so that's something to address. Just try and get those to really line up so they feel like they're following the correct lines compared to the plate. You can see these look as if they're kind of out of perspective in both directions, almost like they could just do with a kind of a global rotation into place. Just beware of little details like this, little matte edges and that sort of thing that can be missed, but just go over everything with a fine tooth comb just to check this all out. And also be aware of just your edge quality. There's some really tiny fine little edges in there. In general it feels okay, but we've got some surfaces like that feel a bit softer, which is alright because they actually feel okay in relation to the plate, which does have a kind of natural built-in softness, but then we have some really sharp lines going on in there as well that just kind of stand out a little bit compared to, again, that natural softness that's in the plate. So just be careful of your line quality when you're doing that sort of thing, and just always try and match back to the plate. So yeah, forgive me for pushing in a bit on that area just to check that out, because there was something that was bothering me about that, which sometimes would cause a supervisor to just do a little crop in and check it out in more detail, and that just did reveal a few of the issues in this area. So moving on to this extension back here, it feels really good actually. There's the perspective on this all feels pretty good. The general the faces that we're seeing here all feel natural. In terms of the kind of acute angles that we're seeing on here, we are getting those same acute angles on there. They feel as though we're seeing about the right amount of the faces. In terms of the lighting back here, you've chosen to kind of flood this kind of back section here with light. I like that you've capped it off, by the way, just so that we don't go off into infinity. That's nice. And I actually don't mind that you've lit this up a bit more either. I mean, you could argue that the plate is in shadow back here, so therefore, and the same with the faces that are facing towards camera here. You could argue that means that we should stick with something that's in shadow, which is valid. But I also think that it is valid to introduce a bit more light back here. Some of these could be turned slightly more. Just the angle of the sun might cause some sunlight to just spill in, or these could be in a bit more shadow from something else off screen anyway. So I think that's fine to do something like that, and I think it works quite well in this case as well. Everything looks fine back here. I think the composition's working quite well. The contrast levels in here fall off quite quickly between here and here. That's something that you might want to have a look at, but it's not too jarring. Just doing a quick comparison with the plate again, I think that you're maybe getting a little bit too warm in your highlights. I think I can understand what you're doing, introducing that kind of warm key lighting, but even if you compare the really warm key lit surfaces in the foreground, they still feel a bit cooler than your surfaces back here, and with the effects of the aerial perspective and depth queuing and such, you would expect that these would be slightly cooler back here, even if locally they are actually the same warmth as something like this warm stone. You would expect that because of the atmosphere they would appear slightly cooler back here anyway, and I think that'll tie everything together a little bit more. And that extends to some of these too, which have also gone maybe just a touch green, maybe just reintroduce a little bit more magenta so that they sit in more with the plate. But it's looking good, and I think everything works pretty well. So with some tweaks, you can get everything to really sing, and I think it's going to look good. The buildings that you've introduced up here are a nice addition too, and some of the faces I feel a little bit simplistic, but then sometimes some of these kind of tall glass structures can just feel a little bit like that even in real life, so that doesn't bother me too much. But I think the work that you're doing looks great. So carry on, and as you continue to build this up, just try and avoid individual buildings just sticking out all on their own up here. I think it's nice to just support those with some other structures, just so they don't feel like they've kind of been plonked into the composition for the sake of adding it. And yeah, other than that, there's not too much to say. Maybe try and bring back some of the little sort of street level filigree and detail that we're getting in here, because these are really nice little additions. And then I think it'd be great to start seeing this turning into more of a kind of commercial street. Alright, so I'm going to have a look at JJ, and this one I thought had a really nice feel to it. As soon as I sort of opened this up, I thought, yeah, that does have a nice feel as that extension, or feels quite natural at a first glance. It's nice. So wanted to go and have a look in a bit more detail. Again, we'll start with the cleanup. So the recreation of the bottom of the building looks good, if maybe a little bit clean. I think some of the tones in the stonework here are maybe getting a bit too bright. Just try and match them in, and just you can see little bits of stonework that are just peeking through now. Fair enough, some of this could be slightly darker because there's a big object in front of it, but I think generally try and match the tones that are in the plate will serve you well. And there are parts of the plate here that are becoming darker for no real apparent reason, the way you could just keep the detail and the values from the original plate. Good job on keeping this exactly as we'd expected to see it from the plate. This is a real nice easy one to do a lineup test with, and easy comparison of the matte painting work, which actually means you've got less places to hide, because there's none of that kind of slight missing of tiny bits, because the image has moved around a little bit. So it does make it harder on yourself, but it makes it easier for a supervisor to do comparisons, which is what you're after. Watch the edges of the banner on the cleanup, because it still feels like we can actually see part of the edge of that banner there, because we're getting the little shadow from it. I think a little bit more cleanup work there could just sort that out. In terms of the removing the stuff up here, it's fine. It'd be cool to see you maybe try and recreate this structure as though the building work that's going on up here has just been completed. Actually putting in a window in the front and try to build up these surfaces with the correct stonework or brickwork or whatever you'd expect to see up here. You can make it up, or better still, have a look at some references and try and figure out what you'd expect to see up there. But the removal looks fairly good. Again, you're getting a few values that are just popping out a little bit that you might not expect from the plate. There is some of that in the plate, so it doesn't jar, but just maybe take another look at that. So on to the cleanup at the street level. The removal of the car there feels good. Looks pretty natural. The same with the little dude crossing the street. Taking him out feels good. I think we start coming into some problems over on the left hand side of the street here. You can kind of see the perspective lines that this should take, and obviously we know we're disappearing to a point down here, so you can kind of expect that the street that cuts across here, that you could expect the kind of sidewalk or curb line to follow that, and actually it takes a real sudden tilt up and loses some of the integrity of the plate when you do that. So I'll just take another look at that. I mean, I have said before that yeah, some of these streets aren't necessarily totally straight, some of them do go uphill, but in this case it just feels a bit like a perspective mismatch in the road surface. So I would really try and bring this back down again, because everything that you've got going on is nice, just feels like we see way too much of this top surface. So I think bringing your end point right down, and then all of this detail, nice detail that's the little light breaking across getting compressed, I think that would work really well. Nice details going off down the street. Everything looks really good actually. It fits in very well with the sort of details that we're seeing. All the red lights going off and the little sort of spindly trees along the roadside all feel really good. The sorts of colours in the buildings feel correct compared to when we look at the plate, which I think that's probably the best handling of that we've seen. And the extra depth cueing, given the fact that this is further away, is good, but actually the tones feel very consistent with what we see in the plate. So again, that's a real nice job. Be careful that some of these stuff, that some of the building tones don't get too saturated and too dark. Some of these feel like they maybe do get a little bit of that kind of deep burgundy red colour, and could maybe be lifted back out a little bit, but I really like some of the tones you've got going, and it does feel very wintry because of that, because you've got the real nice juxtaposition of the cool tones and the warmer brickwork. It feels really nice and wintry, but just be careful that we're not getting too saturated in this stuff, and again, reference some of the tones that are in the plate in the foreground, which are a little less saturated, and just try and match something like that. But otherwise, it's all looking good and definitely going in the right direction. So the set extension work on this one is really coming along nicely. Just pay attention to your perspective and see if you can just sort that out, and I think it'll be really worth doing. And then crack on and try and add a bit more commercialization into the front section, and it's all looking good. Alright, so just moving lastly on to Jan then. I'll just pull that up there. Alright, so again, nice work because everything's lining up with the plate, makes for a nice easy comparison, and there's some really nice work going on in this one again. I know you've been following these workshops with us for a little while now, Jan. But I think I have to say again in this piece, there's some really nice work showing through. The cleanup in the foreground feels great. Some of the edges maybe a touch too clean, and I slightly question the point where this would meet here and the point where it would meet here. It feels like almost like there's a bit of a slope angle on that, and maybe there could be a bit more work just to make sure that that's if you were to follow a point from down here back into the correct perspective, you might expect that the surface finishes a little bit lower. So that's just something to have a little look at. But I'm being very nitpicky, but I know that's what you'll want. So everything else feels good. The tones in the stonework and everything feel great. So no problems there. So moving on to some other areas of the cleanup. Everything on the banner looks fine. I know you've done almost a recreation of a wall back here. It would be cool to see some of these extra details again being recreated as if they were fully built and not just removed totally. And I think the work that you've done on replacing the brickwork is great. I think it would actually be kind of cool if maybe you just reintroduced a little bit of that dirtiness and kind of natural texture, because I quite like that in the plate. It makes it feel a bit more lived. But the technically the work that you're doing up here feels good, so there's nothing really to critique there. So just gonna let my eye move around the image while I toggle these. Removal of the car looks pretty good. Maybe it could be slightly straighter, but you don't want to make it too perfect, so it's no complaints. The removal of the car on this side feels really nice. Nothing really to say about that. I'd be tempted maybe just to, because this is quite a long stretch all the way down, just break it across with something, some sort of little snow heap or just anything that can allow you just to stop this being too much of a flat surface. I mean, you've got some little bits of snow piling coming up, maybe just extending a few bits of those out would be enough to do it. But again, I'm super nitpicking here. So just having another look around the image. Everything feels very natural in this one. I mean, the street set extension feels great. There's a slight lack of contrast in the background here. If you check the fall off, because from here to here, we're still carrying quite a lot of contrast, and then it suddenly seems to drop off very quickly. I do like the fact that it falls off into a bit of a kind of wintry haze, but it's nice to maybe keep a bit more contrast just as we go off back, because it starts to make it look a little bit soft back here, which actually it isn't. I don't think when you check your elements it's fine. It's just losing a bit too much contrast a bit too quickly. So just check that out. I'm just going to toggle again just to be mean and get really nitpicky. So the extra buildings that you've added feel great. I think because we're talking about these being quite reflective surfaces, in the same way as you see the glass surfaces here, with a bit of curvature and all kind of reflecting different bits and pieces, it would be great to see a little bit more of a hint of something being reflected into these big buildings if we're sort of theorising that they're in part of this big area. I think you can get away with that because you do have other buildings that are coming up tall. Obviously, with the angles, you wouldn't expect to see low buildings reflected in here, but I think, you know, some of these taller high-rise buildings, just having something to break these up a little bit is really going to add a little bit more realism, especially if you can get some of that feel of the kind of warping glass effect. But again, just study reference and you'll see. Everything else, I mean, it feels nice compositionally, it's working really well. I like the fact that there's something else breaking the frame here, but that we kind of build up to it, and that it falls about on that third. Looks great. You could still probably support that with a few more buildings that, you know, all come up just kind of like this one does. A few other ones that just come up, just so that we don't feel too empty, just so we feel like this does build up, like it's in a higher rise zone. You're one of the, or maybe the only person who's moved on and started doing some actual work on the shop front replacements, which I have to say feel, again, really natural, really believable. The signage that you've added all feels scale-wise about right, and as do the buildings in the back. Actually, that's another thing to mention. The scale of those feels about right. You know, I believe it when I look at those. The signage all looks great, and it's all that kind of stuff that's does start to make it feel a bit more commercial. You could maybe start to extend that. Things like signage that comes out onto the street, you know, the little chalkboard signs and that sort of thing that get plonked down the street, because often these, you know, commercial streets that are trying to sell their wares, they often do spill out as far onto the street as they can get away with, just to bring in custom and attract any foot traffic. Canopies and those sort of things that extend out over the roads a little bit with more signage on. Again, you can just have a look at reference and see that sort of stuff working. But I mean, all of this feels great. I think you know, there's really not a whole lot to critique here. The work that you're doing actually just feels very natural and looks great. I think with a little bit more attention to detail, just going in and finessing a few little bits, you can really have something that's working really well here. Just one small note again with the faces on the buildings in the back. I'll just demonstrate here, but it does feel like maybe on some of these faces we're just seeing a little bit too much of them compared to how little we see of some of these faces. I do think you could probably make some of these buildings feel a little bit more natural if we just didn't quite see as much of those angling away faces, because you know, there would be such an extreme angle down there. You know, if I toggle that now, you probably make it a bit more obvious that, yeah, you know, you're just seeing a little bit too much of that face. It just starts to make it feel like it must be stretching on forever at that sort of distance. So just by pulling some of those in a bit so that they feel like we're just looking at a real glancing angle down them. I mean, that could just be a super wide building, but just pay attention to that sort of thing, and I think you can add just that little bit of extra touch of natural realism to it. I'll just do a final toggle with the plate, but everything feels great. I mean, this is going to be another awesome little portfolio piece when it's finished. That I think the main thing that my eye was drawn to straight away was the contrast levels, so I would go in for that as soon as you can, and just try and get a bit more of a natural fall off. But you know, I'm being really nitpicky with all of these, and we've got some real great entries, so you know, you guys are all doing some great work, and it's really encouraging to see it all going on. You know, this is what me and Ludo enjoy about doing these workshops, is getting to see all this work coming through and starting to see some of you guys get some real professional looking work out. So yeah, keep it up, and you know, obviously we're going into the last week now, so we'll really start to push the commercialization stuff once you've got your street extension all worked out, and we'll be there on the forums to offer up some more advice and feedback along the way. But thanks for sharing these with us, and we'll see you on the forums.